know. I was asked to do a talk a little while ago, and I'm not a public speaker. I do not like public speaking. My heart is going pretty crazy right now. My hands are sweaty, and that never happens. So, bear with me here.
We got it.
We are with you.
We got
it. So, this is a pretty vulnerable story, but I felt like any other story I was going to share it wouldn't be coming from my authentic self. And this one, I actually, strangely enough, as vulnerable it felt the most comfortable for me to share. So I wrote this down kind of in story form. So here it goes. It was the summer of 2015, and Neil and I were 3 months away from our wedding. We were on a weekend trip to San Diego as we were living in my hometown of West Los Angeles at the time. While we were in the hotel, Neil gets a call. It's from Child Protective Services. He was informed that his 9-year-old son and 12-year-old daughter were removed from their mother's household and taken into foster care for abuse and neglect. Leading up to this, Neil would spend the weekend with his kids in San Jose every few weeks. There were no real warning signs or conversations with the kids that had led us to assume anything was wrong. Sure, there was some teenage angst, but nothing that would have hinted at anything serious. It was a few days later when the courts granted Neil full custody of the kids, and he drove up north to bring them back from foster care to live with us. Now here's the thing, having kids was never part of my plan. Sure, when you decide to marry someone with kids, you take on that responsibility to some extent. But going from hanging out with them every few weeks to taking full custody of them is a whole other level of stepmotherhood I was not prepared for. So technically it was still 3 months until our wedding. I could have bailed. I didn't have to become a full-time step-parent if I didn't want to. There were many times, even after we married, that I could have bailed, but I didn't. My love for Neil was incredibly strong, and still is. If it was anything less than that, I don't think I'd be up here telling this story. Have you ever seen the TLC series where they interview these women who had no idea they were pregnant until they were literally in labor about to give birth in the hospital?
Yes.
I think it was appropriately called I Didn't Know I Was Pregnant. Well, that's how I felt. Going from a life focusing on my career, traveling when I wanted to, really just living my best life with all this freedom, to suddenly finding a bigger place to move into, looking up school district ratings, enrolling 2 kids in school, buying beds and furniture and everything else you could imagine 2 kids would need. That was a trip. Going from those visits to San Jose to being a full-time step-parent was truly eye-opening. Trying to come in and parent 2 kids who, at their mother's home, lived 2 extremes. On one side of the equation, when their mother was not home, they had extreme freedom, kind of like a Lord of the Flies situation. To, in the same home with their mother, a very strict, closed-off, and unpredictable home life when she was home. This is very challenging to walk into. Trying to instill any kind of structure, even physical hygiene guidelines, was met with a lot of arguing, temper tantrums, and you name it. And for what it's worth, I know it was tough on them too. It was hurtful hearing from the kids when they came to live with us that their mother told them that their dad did not want them. Hence why they never told us what was going on, for fear that there would only be retaliation at home by their mother, and no chance of actually getting to live with their dad if they told them what was going on. My stepson kept saying, "Thanks, Dad, for coming to get us," when Neil picked them up from foster care, because he thought his son was going to have to stay with a foster family for the rest of his life. So there I was, flung into this life of motherhood, just 3 months from our wedding date, and not to mention I had just started my own business a month or so before this, asking myself, why me? A part of me was grateful that I was able to step up and help raise the kids and support them along with Neil, give them a more stable and secure upbringing. Then there's this other part of me, this part of me that was just so upset about the circumstances that brought the kids to us, upset about the death of the life I was living up until that point, upset and scared about what was to unfold before me on this journey of motherhood. You don't really see the ripples of trauma and mental illness passed down from one generation to the next until you live with it. My stepdaughter was a very sensitive soul. What happened at home with her mother had affected her, at least outwardly, much more than her brother. Living with the memories of the time with her mother and how she was treated left her in a state of rage and resentment like nothing I'd ever experienced. What I started to realize after the kids came to live with us was that this anger and resentment that my stepdaughter held on to was distorting her reality. Many seemingly good and loving things that happened to her was subsequently filtered through the lens of this anger and victimization. Stories and statements and accusations would be uttered from my stepdaughter's lips that had never actually occurred. Yet she was absolutely convinced that they did. Conversations her and I would have together would be recounted just moments later, entirely different than what was actually said. Really beautiful conversations we would have together, where we really bonded and connected. Just 15 minutes later would be met by her angrily asking me, "Why did you say blah, blah, blah," whatever that may have been. These angry accusations always ended up being a distorted part of our talk, taken from its original context and intention. It was like even though she no longer lived with her mother was always there with her in her mind. It became where when almost anything needed to be said and shared with her, that it had to be put in writing. Words on paper could not be changed. Rather quickly, our home seemed to turn into what felt like a war zone. The unhappy environment that my stepdaughter thought she left at her mother's soon came to live with us in our home. Only her mother was not physically there. But the remnants of her through the behavior of my stepdaughter's behavior was. Losing track here. My bedroom became not only my refuge, but also my prison. It seemed almost daily that my stepdaughter was upset, angry, and confrontational about something real or imagined. I can still imagine hearing footsteps coming towards my bedroom. My heart would start racing. Is it her? What's wrong now? What did I do? The worries, and I dare say terror, cropping up in my mind felt like I was a kid in trouble with her parents all over again. How could this be? A 12-year-old girl making me feel like I was a scared kid all over again. I found myself in what felt like a constant state of alertness, anxiety, and hypervigilance. I became sucked into her world, and it was terrifying. I remember a time where the frequency of these conversations with my stepdaughter were so common that my hands would start to tremble at the thought of it. I distinctly remember a time where I was standing in my kitchen filling a glass of water. I look up and my stepdaughter is standing at the doorway of the kitchen. She says, "Robyn, I need to talk to you about something." Seems like no matter who's uttering these words, it's never a pleasant conversation. Normally, I would act poised, calm, like how an adult should, right? Well, immediately my hands began trembling with this half-full glass of water. I put it down on the counter and this awareness suddenly washed over me as I stood there, shaking, feeling incredibly vulnerable. Instead of acting confident and calm, like I normally did, countless times before over the years, to be the adult that always had it together, I said, "I'm unable to have this conversation right now. My hands are shaking because these types of interactions we have together just create huge amounts of anxiety in me. I'm just not in a good place to talk." Instead of her getting defensive and argumentative, which was the norm, something seemed to click. She got it. She knew that feeling of anxiety, that feeling, that trembling, and that moment of telling her in all of my vulnerability exactly how I was feeling from a very exposed and scary feeling place. She felt connected to that person I was being in that moment. I didn't grow up in a family or society that espoused an attitude of surrender and vulnerability. to expose my weaknesses of anxiety, my trembling, my terror. But it was exactly in that moment of vulnerability that she really heard me. No letters needed to be written. There was no mincing of words. It was just exactly how I felt. No anger, no resentment, just how I was feeling. After that, she never even brought up the discussion she was going to have with me. I wish I could say it was always this easy for me after that moment to be vulnerable with her like that. But that moment has vividly stuck with me to this day. It was the first time I became aware of the power of being vulnerable. It was in that moment that my stepdaughter acted compassionately towards me. It was in that moment that I unwittingly took compassion on myself. It was a strange paradox I was living in, because don't you have to be strong, grounded, and always act calm in the face of hardship? If not, aren't you a coward? Aren't you weak? Who wants to be that? I wish I could say things got better at home, but it didn't. Before you would even walk into a room, you would feel her presence. I remember I would walk into the kitchen as she's eating at the kitchenette, and I would say, "Good morning." She would not even look at me, barely acknowledge my existence. This is on a good day. I could always immediately feel the annoyance in her voice and posture when someone else would enter her space. It made going out into your own home a rather uncomfortable experience. There was a lot of professional help along the way, which I'm incredibly grateful for. But she kept slipping down into this dark place. Technology, I believe, also played a part in this. Her cell phone had become her and her brother's constant companion and babysitter before they came to live with us. So implementing limits on their tech time to promote better life balance and also increase the odds of homework getting done came with intense anger from my stepdaughter. Her dad and I were conflicted because we saw the positive effects that limiting her tech time had on her overall demeanor, but her arguing over this technology never ceased. I'll hand it to her, she was persistent and relentless when she felt strongly about something. She would make a great justice warrior. So this tech limit was a huge point of contention with us every day. The kids were supposed to put their cell phones on the living room table at the same time every night. But if you know kids, that rarely happens. When constantly reminding my stepdaughter about putting away her cell phone, excuses, anger, and confrontation would usually occur. Having to walk up to her closed door and knock on it and remind her to put her cell phone on the counter was like knocking on anger's door. Nothing positive ever came out of those situations. It was a few years into the kids living with us, and a friend of mine who was helping me with my business at home called and left me a voicemail as I was driving back from visiting a client. A woman from Child Protective Services came to the house and was asking about my stepdaughter. Apparently, my stepdaughter had called CPS on us because she felt like we were emotionally neglecting her and she no longer wanted to live with us. We learned about the reason for her call to them a while later, but as I'm listening to this voicemail, my heart is racing. I knew there was nothing for CPS to actually have a real case against us. We also had a lot of support and many professionals working with us to help her up until this point who knew exactly what was going on and could speak with CPS. So there's no real cause for alarm, but it just felt like, what's next? You know, even when it's a kid, when you're feeling constantly attacked by someone you're trying to help and support, sometimes you just want to be human. You just want to allow yourself to express your humanity and say, like, why are you treating me this way? What did I do to deserve this? But I also knew the distorted lens that she saw life through and how being human in that way would only exacerbate matters. It would just add gasoline to the fire. Neil and I were stuck between a rock and a hard place. We needed a village. We needed a help so great we didn't even know it existed. Then one day a friend came over to our house who knew about our challenges with my stepdaughter. She spoke about a friend of hers who was able to send her daughter to a facility called Heritage in Utah. It was a therapeutic boarding facility for kids with behavioral issues who were not or could not thrive and grow in their current environment. My friend spoke about the incredible changes that occurred with her friend's daughter, which sounded very similar to my stepdaughter's, that were really, truly remarkable. You know the universe is listening and has your back when moments like this happen. After the incident with CPS, we had a delicate conversation with my stepdaughter, who was in favor of this therapeutic school called Heritage. She gladly went a week or two after this conversation. After she went to Heritage, I was completely and utterly exhausted, and my nervous system was a wreck. I wasn't sleeping. I woke up daily with debilitating anxiety. I had been having stomach and digestive issues. My marriage had taken a huge toll during this time. And I just couldn't function in a normal and healthy way anymore. I also had to take a break from my business that I had put so much energy into. It was incredibly hard for me. I cried a lot. Honestly, there are a lot of tears I shed during those last few years. It was during this year that my stepdaughter was at Heritage that I really dove hard into my spiritual and meditation practice as a form of healing. I did a lot of healing that year. I also had a lot of forgiving to do for my stepdaughter, her mother, for feeling like I let myself down, for the life I thought I was going to have, for my mental and physical state. If you want to learn the art of compassion from my experience, it starts with forgiveness. Forgiving others who didn't know what they were doing. Forgiving myself for not being the lively, confident person I knew myself as. It always seems easier to do this when you can step away from the heightened situation and look at it from a distance, when you're no longer caught in the middle of it. So flash forward to a year at her being at Heritage, and my stepdaughter was a much happier and grounded person. Her transformation honestly seemed like a miracle. It was like she did a complete 180. We all decided to have her come back home and live with us. We were excited, but we were also cautious. After she came back to live with us, things were good for the first couple of months. Over time, however, it became apparent that there were some old patterns that were starting to reemerge. I kind of liken it to when, let's say, someone has an addiction of some kind, even though they've been sober for a period, when they start putting themselves in situations that used to trigger those cravings. That's the closest comparison I have to what happened after she came back to live with us. The biggest of which was her old pattern of being averse to anyone in a parental role, implementing any kind of structure. There's a huge lack of trust with parents and authority figures with her. The first time this happened, I noticed the distorted thinking again, and the filter of victimization emerge in a small confrontation she had with me. Immediately, I felt my heart racing again, which I hadn't felt since the last year she was away. I felt my face go flush, and all the old memories and confrontations and attacks started flooding back. My anxiety was heightened again, and I felt that old friend hypervigilance crop up. Here goes again, I said. I thought those days were over, but they quickly started to make their way back in. By this time, I had implemented an intense meditation and yoga practice. It helped with my anxiety, but not completely. After several months of things going downhill again with her at home, it became very apparent that this was not a healthy situation for anyone. I recall a scenario, I can't even remember exactly what it was about anymore, where Neil and I were again the target of her anger. It always seemed to come out of nowhere. That was maybe the most unsettling part of those moments, because you were always caught off guard. It was in that moment that something clicked in me, and I said, no more. I realized in that moment that we were trying to make something work that was never going to work. So we found another therapeutic school, this time one that would help teenagers prepare for living on their own. She was 17 at the time. She agreed, and it's been over a year now. Actually, no, it's been over 2 years. And so she's actually been living on her own now for over a year. And if you know her, you know that this is a miracle in and of itself. So after she left for the second time, I felt like there was darkness that had taken over me. I also had to take another break from my business that I had revamped and had running. Again, it felt absolutely devastating in so many ways. How could I let this happen a second time? I asked, just so disappointed and angry that this happened all over again. It was like my worst fear had literally come true. In addition to the anxiety and intense fatigue I felt at this time, I had incredible brain fog. It literally felt like my soul had left my body. I remember talking to a friend at an event during this time, and I asked him the same question 3 times back to back. It was really scary. I also lost my desire to cook, which I loved, my desire to do yoga, which I also loved, and any willpower I had to meditate was completely gone, literally overnight. It evaporated. I didn't understand it. I've never heard of this, and I had certainly never experienced this before. I asked myself, was I losing my mind? I then took the next 2 years to focus largely on my healing. I immersed myself in spiritual books, surrendered to outside help in various forms, immersed myself in the teachings of Ram Dass, Thich Nhat Hanh, Byron Katie, Ramana Maharshi, and the list goes on and on. It's in those moments when you truly realize the meaning of surrender, and knowing that you don't have all the answers, that you need others to help you, because I couldn't help myself. Talk about feeling vulnerable and scared. For a while I thought the brain fog and my fatigue would just go away on their own. But every morning I would wake up and there they were. Nothing was changing. It was over a year and I came to this realization that I felt like I had given my power away. I was feeling hopeless, like why even bother? I didn't trust myself. The situation with my stepdaughter happened twice. Why wouldn't there be other situations where it wouldn't just happen again? But something shifted in me one day. I was tired of feeling tired and hopeless. I then said, if my brain fog and fatigue can appear one day out of nowhere, it can also go away just as fast. Funny, because when I think back on that time, I was hopeful that my hopelessness would go away. Amazing how our mind plays tricks on us. Well, they didn't just go away in a day. From that day forward, I knew that I could be back to my own self. I just knew. I started being more consciously aware of and emphasizing my moments of clarity and recall versus just noticing the foggy moments. Even though gravity felt pretty strong at that time with my fatigue, I started to notice that doing gentle yoga and Pilates with other people I could manage. Something about doing it with community completely shifted things for me. I would step into my Pilates class and my teacher Anastasia would, and also currently always asks, how's your body feeling today? Or how are you doing? Many of those days it was me saying, I'm tired. And she met me there. I was so used to living in a world where you just had to push and force yourself to do the things you were supposed to do. But in these moments, she gave me permission to meet myself where I was at, to have compassion for how I was showing up that day and not pushing or telling me that I'm supposed to be energized, excited, or I'll get you pumped up by the end of the session. She allowed me to be exactly who I was in that moment with no expectations. And so I ask, where could you meet yourself with more compassion? Where could you meet others with more compassion? Can you forgive yourself and others over and over and over again to allow the compassion that resides on the other side of that to continually emerge? And I'll end with this quote by one of my favorite modern day teachers, Byron Katie, and it says, when you realize that every stressful moment you experience is a gift that points you to your own freedom, life becomes very kind. Thank you.